Now, for this course section, I'm still using the project we worked on in the previous section, so I use the final state of that project with our tests added to it, and you find the latest snapshot attached to this lecture in case you didn't follow along, which I do recommend though, because of course the knowledge from the previous section is expected in this section. Now, if we take a look at the project we worked on, and I was working in this front-end project, we could have added the same tests in all these projects, though they would work in all these projects. But if I take a look at this project we worked on, this front-end project, then of course at the moment there are two JavaScript files, the parser.js file and the app.js file, for which we haven't written any tests yet. Now, the parser.js file is actually a pretty simple file with a simple function inside of it, but this function has one special thing that it's doing. It's using a feature that's built into the browser, the form data object, and we'll get back to that later in the course. The app.js file, on the other hand, is also using some built-in browser features and APIs, but besides that, it's also probably our most complex JavaScript files, which is doing many different things. We're doing many things here in this one single function that we have inside of the app.js file, and then we also get some code that's not inside of a function. And of course, typically, we would want to test the code that is in this file as well. But since this one function is doing so many things, the question is, how do we test this? And it's not just the sheer amount of code in this function and the fact that this function is doing many things. It's also interesting to note that in this file, we are using certain browser APIs, like document query selector or get element by ID, or creating this form data object, which we're then passing into this extract numbers function I mentioned before. So we're using a bunch of built-in browser features. And this is important because when writing tests, there are certain things you should and you should not test. And one very important rule that you absolutely should memorize and follow is that your tests should only test your code, your application code. Don't test any third-party code, so code from third-party packages or libraries or frameworks, or code or features that's built into the environment you're working with. Don't test those browser APIs. Don't test native Node.js packages. Instead, you want to test your code because you don't want to test what you can't change. And that's one very important rule. If we are writing tests for our code, we don't want to test whether document query selector correctly returns a form if there is a form in our HTML file. We might want to check if we use that form correctly. We might want to check and test if there is a form in the HTML document in the first place, because that are the things we can influence as a developer, but we don't need to test if query selector works technically. The same would be true for form data or any other browser APIs or whatever environment you're working with. Of course, those features, like query selector, this method, those features could have bugs, they could fail in certain scenarios where they shouldn't, but it's not your job to fix those bugs. If you're working on those APIs, if you're contributing to those projects, then in the scope of those projects, you might want to test those things. But you don't want to test such third-party APIs in your code, in your project, because you can't influence them anyways. So that's one very important rule. For example, if you would be using the fetch function in your code, which is a browser API for sending HTTP requests, then you would not want to test if it works as intended. You also would not want to test the server-side or backend code implicitly via your client-side code. So when your app, your frontend, sends a request to the backend, of course, some backend code is executed, and you don't want to test that backend code implicitly by writing a test in your frontend project. If you own the backend, if it's your own API, your own backend API you're talking to, then you would want to write separate tests that run independently from the frontend tests in your backend project for your backend code. But you don't want to implicitly test your backend from your frontend with your frontend tests. What you would want to test in your frontend project, though, would be your reaction to the response you get back when you're sending a request. So your reaction to the expected response data, to missing response data, to possible errors you might be getting back, that's what you would want to test. And it's really important to always think about what your project and code is doing and to therefore derive what you want to test. That is really, really important. So testing only your code is important. And that means that for this project here, I, for example, don't want to test if document query selector works technically. I might want to test if there is a form in the HTML document because it's my responsibility as a developer of this front-end project to make sure that there is, but I don't want to test if query selector works technically.